Chapter 1: Splitting from the Self. Professor Krivoruchko is a sailor. Professor Krivoruchko is fictional and a composite character. He has many fragments, and every character in this book corresponds to one of his fragments. Professor Krivoruchko represents an individual who is immune to split and who is able to unify his fragments. He is a whole person, an individual with solid psyche who shows us how to respond to the forces inside and outside of his psyche. He represents flexibility, tolerance, and unification. To be a child of love, he wants to unify with the genetic heritage. Because his ancestors were massacred by Nazis, he has a lot of fears, but he understands his problems and deals with them on the conscious level. Professor Krivoruchko is descended from the unfortunates who were physically annihilated for the sake of a murky theory about genetic hegemony. He affirmed, "We were selected for annihilation on a genetic basis and were declared to be unfit to support the biggest pretentiousness of our time. We were killed by a mob that was thirsty for blood. The throngs were the fools of pomposity and used shovels to kill helpless children, women, and the elderly. They killed children in front of the mothers. If the fools had children and grandchildren that had genetic defect, even if they were on the side of the villains, their offspring was annihilated too. Nevertheless, the villains did not recover their nature, and nothing may shake their belief in their cause because they know that we are not they, and we are not driven by hate." They were sometimes forced to change their cause, but underneath the same hate always was. The splitting that was inflicted on our world continues to affect many psyches. To deal with hate, we need to understand the social eradication, genetic abolition, and religious obliteration, and the many divergent types of revulsion. Professor Krivoruchko is intended to be an individual with a solid identity, and his comments are important. He believes that our solid identity can take diverse forms. We have potency to be part of any distinct religion, ideology, and ethnicity, but most important is that it has a foundation of love. We make a subconscious effort to achieve unification and to defeat the forces of hate. The splitting forces are strong, but we also have a strong resistance to the hate. We need to find a future direction where our lives go." Unquote. The splitting about religion. Professor Krivoruchko's psyche is a combination of dissimilar fragments. He has a Gentile mother, but he also has a strong feeling of being Jewish. In every religion, the members display distinct levels of devotion, and this reality may be a cause of splitting. The religious splitting is usually very antagonistic. The widely divergent groups of parishes are hateful to their surroundings and take on the responsibility of estimating the acceptable level of devotion and setting up the norms and requirements. Professor Krivoruchko has strong feelings about this issue. Quote, "We are disturbed by the fact that even between the chosen, some frictions exist, including the Jewish Orthodox and the Reform movements. For the Orthodox believers, I am probably not a Jew at all. My relatives hid their identity and didn't eat kosher food, and my father married a Gentile woman. Nevertheless, I am proud of my cultural and ethical background. For the Orthodox believer, those who do not have a Jewish mother and are not Jews at all, and I need to go through a complex process to become a Jew." Unquote. Because Professor Krivoruchko did not have a Jewish mother, he did not have knowledge about how to relate to his friends when they joked about Jewish mothers. His father was deprived of his Jewish heritage and hid his identity. His family lived in a harsh world, and they always needed to fight for survival. They were victims of oppressive social structures and inhuman ideologies. They were emotionally broken and very scared. Many families were in the same situation, and this one was one reason why he had to go to Israel. He wanted to regain his pride and feel good to be a Jew. He had his circumcision, studied the Hebrew language and scriptures, and had a bar mitzvah at 21. He was one of the many who did not have a Jewish mother. He was a soldier in the Israeli army, and some of his friends were even killed. In the soldiers' cemetery, the dead ones that for some reason were not considered Jewish were not allowed to be interred next to their fallen comrades. They were buried behind the cemetery wall. Krivoruchko thought this was very wrong. He was against this kind of distinction between dead soldiers because they all fought and died for Israel. He believed if soldiers were accepted to fight and to die for Israel, then they were all children of Israel. Emotionally, he felt apart, but nevertheless, he did not give up the quest for self-identity. He needed to resist the splitting forces in his psyche and find the strength to have a genuine dialogue. Professor Krivoruchko believed that the solid self-identity is a representation of real love inside everyone, whoever they might be. To have love, we do not need any reason. We also want to identify with the smart and the powerful. Professor Krivoruchko understood that some groups were more precise in interpreting the Bible. They do not want to give up their restrictive attitude or to be more flexible because they do not want to be around anyone who does not belong. He wanted to understand both sides and did not know what was better for religion, to have a limited membership or an open enrollment. Eventually, he understood that both were needed, but at different times. Nowadays, we have a genetic test and do not need to guess about who is the father of the child. In the past, the mother was chosen as the carrier of ethnicity because genetic tests were not available, and it was not certain if the father was Jewish. The mother was chosen in identifying the Jewish ethnicity. Everyone who had a Jewish mother was ethnically a Jew. Professor Krivoruchko's wife is a Jewish woman, and regardless of his own ethnicity, his son has a Jewish mother and has important clout to satisfy all requirements. His son also will have the facts to relate to the jokes about Jewish mothers. Professor Krivoruchko has warm feelings about his wife. He mentions that he met and fell in love with his wife in a kibbutz, where he was on vacation from his duties as a soldier. He is not ashamed that he was looking for a Jewish woman to love and to have a life together. Intuitively, he believed in God, but being a member of the Soviet collective, he did not know much about religion. He wanted to do the right thing and went to a Jewish state. Professor Krivoruchko made a choice for the self. I wanted to do the right thing because for the terror groups, it did not matter what kind of devotion to God I have. It did not make any difference to fascists to what group of Judaism, Christianity, or Islam I belonged. We were slaughtered not for our religion, but as an ethnic group. This massacre was based on our genetic characteristics. We were selected for annihilation to be a target of hate and violence. We still suffer from very deep persecutory trauma. The big poisonous cloud stayed over us for generations. It is impossible for anyone to comprehend the extent of our tragedy. It was also hard to imagine that we had the power to recuperate and continue to function. In one family where many members were killed, a little boy was able to survive, and he is my father. The offspring of this boy are searching for their identity because we still suffer from our deep persecutory trauma. The immense, venomous swirl took over our mind. Even if we, who have not been targets of hate, have a big split in our psyche, because in this world, everything is interconnected. The Holocaust was not only the tragedy of Jewish people, but also the whole world. The whole psyche of the world fell apart under the attack of hate and viciousness. We are still under attack and do not have any guarantee of survival, only a hope. It is very sad that the children of survivors have a feeling of discomfort if they are affiliated with crowds, which the group proceeds to be left devoted. Regrettably, religious groups are setting the standard of devotion to God and want the separation from the faction, which they labeled as less devoted. They feel that they are the protectors of a tradition, and instead of unifying in spirituality around God, they are splitting. To unify, they must appreciate divergences, and we have to respect their beliefs. The benefit of splitting through generations. Splitting through generations in some instances is important for survival and for preserving the future opportunity to build a solid identity. The quest for the original identity perhaps may take many generations, and it's important that unification is central in building a solid identity, but splitting is also important for survival. Professor Krivoruchko had a goal to unify with his life, which was splitting from the horror and threatened his existence. He avowed, quote, "The victims of the cruelty and violence are splitting from the damaged fragments in their psyche. The hope is that we will be able to rebuild our life. When it is not safe to maintain the original identity, our splitting continues through generations. Splitting through generations continues until life is more secure, and we have the strength to get back our original identity. When the events are out of our control, our split perhaps might be a necessity of life." Unquote. The split through generations. Professor Krivoruchko's fragments, his grandfather and father, were the survivors of the Holocaust, and they were able to survive the tragedy because of the split. Professor Krivoruchko is also part of a massacred family, which includes his grandmother Rivka, his aunt Lizochka, who was a baby at the time of the carnage, and his great-grandfather Herschel. They were victims of a fascist slaughter. The fragment of his great-grandfather Herschel is the one who made an attempt to avoid splitting by relying on past experiences. Grandmother Rivka felt that the split was necessary to survive, so if she had listened to her father, then Professor Krivoruchko would not be around to tell their story. The inhuman facts of history about the Holocaust and genocide are the worst examples of hate, which leave only one solution for survival: splitting and fragmentation. The fragmentation helps to protect a part of the psyche from complete destruction. After fascist occupation of part of Ukraine, the invading forces began the annihilation of the Jews. Professor Krivoruchko acknowledges that sometimes for survival, one pays a terrible price. The two young adolescents, brother and sister, ran away from the Babi Yar, the place of the slaughtering of the Jews. When they traveled on the road, the group of young Polizais, the local collaborators groups associated with fascists that traveled in the back of a truck, spotted them. They jumped from the truck, grabbed the girl by the hand, and lifted her up on the truck. Her brother was very scared and did not do anything to pull her back or to defend her. He ran after the truck and saw how the Polizais raped his little sister and then killed her. She was only 12 years old, and he was 16. Hate generated their splitting and killing. The Nazis split from humanity to nurture their feelings of grandiosity and power. They anesthetized the self from feelings of compassion. Professor Krivoruchko declared they were killing and using us as inanimate objects. They did not worry about guilt because we were not human and did not have feelings. When they were treating us as objects, they were detaching the self from our suffering. They were vicious, cruel, violent, and inhuman. The brother of the killed girl survived. He lived a long life, but he did not enjoy any of his days, and he was miserable. He suffered from nightmares and impotence, and he was afraid of everything and everyone. Everyone around him was miserable, including his wife and children. The misery was a price for survival. He lives, but his life was worse than death. He has a deadly mark, which he transfers to his family, and his split from happiness was generational. The hope is that after several generations, his future offspring, if they have a chance, will be able to unify with the joy of life. By splitting, we protect loved ones. Professor Krivoruchko states, quote, "In some instances, we need to split from the loved ones to protect them. Despite the danger we are facing, we do not want to split. We are not able to split and leave behind the beloved who need us because we are dedicated to love. Contrary to self-sacrificing individuals, the selfish have the capacity to kill, betray, and to be completely insensitive to suffering around them. They will do anything to stay alive and do not have any moral limits for self-preservation." Unquote. Professor Krivoruchko's grandmother chose to be together and not to split with her baby daughter and her father. She was with them until the last breath and died with them. She wanted her son to survive, but even the split for survival would demand a heavy price from her boy. The split was needed as a hope for the future and to avoid complete destruction of the family. Her son, Leonya, will never again see his mother, grandfather, or sister. When Rivka decided to split from her son, she did not know she was saving his life. Her son suffered a lot, but was able to overcome all barriers and stay alive. In many instances, in moments of danger, the psyche is resistant to splitting from the loved one sometimes is impossible. The mother does not have the strength to leave her sick baby daughter and her old father who are completely helpless. The mother is choosing to share the horrors of death with her loved ones, and they were unified in death. The unification in death is the most awful way of unification, but the horror of splitting from the sick baby is worse than dying. During a terrorist attack of a school in the Caucasus Mountains, some mothers were allowed by the terrorists to get out with one little child and leave behind an older child. The mothers went out to bring a little child to safety, and they left their older child, but very soon they returned to be with the second child until their death. The mothers chose unifying and dying with their children. The worst thing for a mother is abandoning her child. Professor Krivoruchko disclosed that his father, Leonid Alexandrovich Krivoruchko, well remembered September of the year of 1941 in the capital of Ukraine, occupied by fascists. For Leonya, and in the later years as Leonid Alexandrovich, his mind did always show clearly the memories of the day when there appeared papers on the fences of Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, showing an order addressed to the Jews of that city. He remembers his mother's question, "What now? To what Palestine are they sending us?" Grandfather Herschel kept repeating, quote, "In 1916, during the First World War, a German officer was billeted in my house. He loved children and always used to give them candies. Rivka, the children of such a German, cannot possibly hurt us. If you are afraid, please do not follow this order, and I will go by myself." Unquote. Quote, "I would like to believe you, Papa," Mother replied, "but you know neighbors are not saying things for nothing. If it weren't for Lizochka's fever, I would run away from Kiev with neighbors. But I look at her, how can I leave her now? I will go with you." Unquote. Professor Krivoruchko aide, quote, "The resistance to the split was rooted in our sincere belief that humanity would be restored and that the scary stories were just the result of confusion. We want to believe that life is harmonious and fair. We have the compulsion to accept unfairness in our existence. By relying on past experiences and common sense, we are not prepared to deal with the tragedy caused by the fascists. Nothing in our past was closer to that magnitude of this hate. Despite common sense, the fears were causing the split. When we are completely destroyed, we do not have hope that we may function again. We need to save part of our psyche. With fragmentation, we are losing our identity and are acting on the mercy of small fragments, which are taking over our psyche. But as a reward, they give us a small chance for continuation. Only fragmentation gives a chance for surviving. If an individual had a way to survive, then it is hope that the little fragments may be united in the future. We might be taken over by grandiosity. When our psyche is affected by pomposity and grandiosity, it requires more splitting and will eventually become a machine of splitting. Our fragments split from our own feelings to serve radical ideas. The pompous and posturing people want everyone to be their servants. For the radicals, everyone unlike them is an object, and they will slay him without any human feelings. Radicals believe that they have a mission, which is the foundation of the feeling of grandiosity. It allows them to split from humanity and see others as objects. The split of radicalization is particularly vicious. Professor Krivoruchko's father, as a young boy, did not know this tendency of pomposity that graded those who were dissimilar as subhuman. But he understood that something very horrible was going on, and he was scared. For a young child who had been split from loved ones and from his mother, it was a very traumatic experience that haunted him for the rest of his life. He split and ran. Otherwise, he would be fed to the machine of pretentiousness of being superhuman, which strived to become bigger. To save Leonya's life, his mother initiated Leonya's separation from the family. Rivka instinctively felt that the apparatus of pretension and mannerism was going to consume all of them. She did not understand that the only way to save her son from being murdered by fascists was to split. She was aware that her child would be estranged from her, his little sister, and his grandfather, and would never see them again. This was a crucial point in Professor Krivoruchko's life. Behind the split was his future life. Otherwise, the pomposity and grandiosity would consume him. Leonya did not know that he was spared from death and would have a long life. He would also meet a beautiful woman and marry her and raise a family. At the time of splitting, he did not know anything about his future and was just a scared little boy who missed his family. He did not know to whom he should listen. His mother made the decision, which was impossible for him to comprehend. Only later in life did Leonia understand that to survive, sometimes we need to break away. The mannerism can always find justification for killing by presenting the self as a victim of somebody else's conspiracy. The pomposity implied that the Jews were guilty because they had somehow damaged the pride of grandiosity. The fascists declared that the conspiracy of the Jews was very daunting and damaging and that they needed to suffer. In societies associated with pomposity, Jews were always the scapegoats and were already selected by the slaughter machine. The gaudiness did not need any new scapegoats. By aggrandizing the self and downgrading everyone who was unlike as subhuman, the grandiosity was represented by huge projects in art, architecture, and parades. In the meantime, the little boy was a victim of the heartless apparatus and needed to survive by any means. Grandfather Herschel believed in humanity. He had lived through pogroms and civil war. He knew that men had the capability to be worse than a beast, but still he defended humankind and the stability of common sense. Quote, "You are doing the right thing by not running away," Grandfather told Rivka. "I am sure that the Germans will send us to Palestine. They won't let us take our belongings because of the war and a shortage of transportation." Unquote. Grandfather chanted his prayers. He believed in God and humanity, and he thought that goodness would always overcome and that evil would lose. For him, it was incomprehensible to think that someone might hurt him without any reason or any remorse. He was using common sense, which does not work with the psyches infected by the virus of pretentiousness. Leonia, who was then 12 years old, helped Mother gather up some clothing and fed his 3-year-old sister with medicine. The following morning, the street was full of neighbors. His mother pushed a baby carriage with 2 suitcases. Grandfather held Lizochka in his arms. Leonia carried a large bag and looked at the neighbors leaving their homes. They too carried some belongings. Suddenly Mother said, "Leonia, don't come with us, son. I am worried, and if all goes well, you will come back. Meanwhile, don't sleep at home during the next few days. If things are bad with us, find your way to the town where Auntie Polina is living." Unquote. Auntie Polina, Mother's school friend, was a Ukrainian woman, and last summer the whole family had visited her. Mother was crying as she kissed Leonia, and then he kissed Lizochka. To this day, Leonid can feel his sister's warm cheek on his lips. He embraced his grandfather. Quote, "Everything will be all right, Leonichka. Your mother panics easily. We shall only become separated because of her. But on the other hand, God takes care of the careful." Unquote. Grandfather gave him some money, and Mother put some food in his bag and wept as she kissed him again. He was leaving them without knowing that he was escaping death. His mother stood still, and when he turned his head, he saw her standing near Grandfather holding Lizochka in her arms. For Leonia, the only way to deal with this deadly mechanism of pretension was forcing the self to disregard the desire to be with his family and to resist the natural drive for unification. He did not know that the machine of pretentiousness, of being superhuman, had exterminated his family. Professor Krivoruchko mentioned, quote, "My great-grandfather had displayed a lot of common sense, which may be expected from the old and wise man. His common sense applied to the Germans, but not to radicals. The radicalized would not listen to any common sense because common sense contradicted their needs. When we are facing the splitting machine, then in order to survive, we need to split. The interaction with radicals results only in 2 forms, confrontation or hiding. The radical ideology will twist all common sense, will not worry about humanity and the rules of decency, and will not leave space even for negotiations." Unquote. The killing machine employs, as operators, only special individuals. Professor Krivoruchko acknowledges that the killing machine is one of the many modifiers of the apparatus of pretentiousness, which operated because of a high cause. It enrolled as the operators the individuals who had split from feelings of guilt. The splitting from feelings of guilt was influenced by the desire to become more active devices of mannerisms. The grandiosity aggrandized the quality of a low life by using the mannerism of being superhuman, pretending to have purity of blood or thought, and as a result feelings of being special. It made one believe that the superhuman has the right to label a disparate group as subhuman and to exterminate that inferior group. The splitting machine effectively pushed a man to hate his neighbor. Many neighbors were massacred by other neighbors. The graves of those who were unified in death are everywhere. The splitting machine was programmed as a killing machine to do the job without any feelings of guilt. When a group was marked by the machine as subhuman, the machine denied them any human feelings and, most important, the soul. It was easier considering them animals and dispensing with them as unneeded garbage. We know that objects do not have human feelings. By destroying an object, we do not feel guilt or remorse. In the hierarchy of the butchery devices, we were marked lower than animals. It was similar to getting rid of a parasite. The slaughtering of us became the pride of the apparatus of pretentiousness. The splitting forces were able to convert many to be servants. The servants, responsible for exterminating, mainly consisted of the scared or brainwashed, which allowed the self to become a mechanical device. They were operated by this skillful manipulator, who actually might not even imagine the extent of his actions. Their leaders can be fanatics, tyrants, criminals, cult members, and many others who were miserable and looking for a cause to escape from misery and vanity. The assassination machine was always in motion, looking for the next prey, and was bloodthirsty. It did not matter that many servants of the assassination machine were not of a familiar ethnicity as the superhuman, and that their background was far removed from the extraordinary. They were marked to be the next group for extermination. The massacre's engine is still working in this time, but by changed names and in diverse regions. The killing machine is reproducing the self by creating many varieties of killing machines. Professor Krivoruchko came from a country filled with mass graves of helpless women, children, and elderly. Many victims were buried alive and few were shot, but many were killed with crowbars and metal shovels or asphyxiated in gas chambers. Many radicals ignored the suffering of these victims. Monuments for the dead were not built for a very long time. Meanwhile, Leonio was able to escape the massacre. He walked all day to the outskirts of the city, and at night he slept on the grass using his bag as a pillow. On the following day, while walking through the marketplace, he overheard the market women talking tearfully in whispers among themselves. Quote, "The Germans shot everyone at Babi Yar more than the eye has strength to see. No one was spared, old, young, even infants." Unquote. One of the women was shouting loudly, "They were not Germans who did the killing. They were our Ukrainian boys. They have helped rid of the Ukraine of an evil. It should have been done long ago." Unquote. Leonia ran away, curled up in the grass, and cried. He tried not to believe that someone had killed his mother, his sister, and grandfather, but he understood that it was true. He felt terrified and lonely. His thoughts were also of his father, who was fighting at the front as an officer and would take revenge. The slaughtered were the victims of the killing machine, but as survivors, we are also the victims, because we are forced to think about revenge and killings. We were able to survive, but were splitting from our feelings of guilt. We executed the members of the apparatus of pretentiousness and mannerism, and we did it blindly without any feeling of guilt and remorse. We are also examples of the killing machines. Any fanatics are part of the carnage, which is operating by the feeling of grandiosity. They want to rise above the feelings of guilt and remorse. The killing machines are very damaging to whatever causes they defend, and they eventually kill their own, which are not pure enough. The grandiosity devices, by killing and splitting, take away the feelings of guilt and start the rampages, which they cannot stop.